The bill came to $43,000. Nadia didn't flinch. She signed where they told her to sign, transferred what she'd spent 4 years saving, and watched the number go from her account to a hospital she'd never been to before she met Grant. His mother was in surgery by noon. He held Nadia's hand in the waiting room and said, and she remembers this exactly because she has replayed it more times than she can count. He said, "You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever loved." She believed him. That's the part she keeps coming back to. Not the money, not what came after, just that she believed him completely in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights while his mother's chest was being opened 2 floors above them, and she actually felt lucky. That's where we're starting. Not at the end, not at the moment she found out, right here, in the waiting room. Because this is where the story actually begins. Before the recovery, before the 6 months that followed, before the Tuesday in February when he sat down across from her at the kitchen table with a look on his face she had never seen before and told her that he needed space. Space. After the $43,000. I need you to stay with me right there for a second, because that word, space, is going to do a lot of work in this story. It's going to explain things that don't make sense yet. It's going to reframe things she thought she understood. And by the time we get to the end of this, you're going to hear that word and feel something specific. Something you might not have a name for right now. But we're not there yet. Nadia is 34 when this story starts. She's a respiratory therapist, which, if you know anything about respiratory therapists, already tells you something. These are people who are trained to stay calm when everything around them is not. Who walk into rooms where someone can't breathe and make decisions fast and don't panic. Nadia is good at her job. She is composed. She is practical. She is not, by her own description, someone who does things impulsively. She met Grant at a work conference 3 years before the surgery. He was there as a pharmaceutical rep, which she will later describe with a laugh that doesn't quite reach her eyes. Not because there's anything wrong with pharmaceutical reps, just because of what she knows now about the particular skill set that job requires. How you learn to read a room. How you learn which door to knock on twice and which ones to leave alone. How you learn that the right pitch at the right moment can move something that seemed impossible. He was charming, obviously. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is that he wasn't charming in a flashy way. He wasn't the loudest person at the dinner. He was the one who remembered what you'd said an hour earlier and brought it back like it mattered. He made Nadia feel seen in the specific way that is very hard to manufacture and very easy to mistake for something real. They dated for 8 months before she met his mother, Iris. And Iris, here's where I need you to pay attention. Iris was warm, immediately. Pulled Nadia into a hug like she'd been waiting for her. Told her she was exactly what she'd hoped for. Made her feel, within 20 minutes of walking through the door, like she'd already passed some test she didn't know she was taking. Nadia loved her, genuinely. That matters. So when Iris's diagnosis came, stage 3, aggressive, the kind of timeline that makes you stop mid-sentence, Nadia didn't hesitate. Grant didn't have the money. His savings were thin from a rough couple of years he'd alluded to but never fully explained. His sister was overseas and stretched. And Nadia had the money. She had it because she had been careful and consistent and deliberate for a decade, the way responsible people are. She had it because she was the kind of person who planned for emergencies. She just hadn't planned for this one. The surgery went well. Iris came through. She spent 6 weeks at Grant and Nadia's apartment recovering, in the guest room that Nadia had prepped with new linens and a white noise machine and a basket of things she thought Iris might need. Grant was attentive during that time, grateful. He said all the right things the way he always did. And then Iris went home. And then something shifted. It was small at first. The kind of small that you talk yourself out of noticing because you don't want to be the person who keeps score. A little more distance, a little less warmth. Dinners that got shorter. Conversations that got surface level in a way that felt like a door slowly, quietly closing. She told herself he was tired. The stress of his mother's illness. The weight of watching someone you love go through something like that. She was a healthcare worker. She understood recovery. She understood that caregiving takes something out of you, even when you're not the one doing most of the caring. She gave him time. She always gave him time. 6 months is a long time to explain something away. Nadia tried every version. He was processing. He was grieving in advance, the fear of almost losing his mother, doing something to him that hadn't fully surfaced yet. He was under pressure at work, which he mentioned once in passing, and she held onto like a lifeline. She was a fixer by nature, by training, by temperament. And so she did what fixers do. She looked for the source of the problem so she could solve it. What she didn't consider, not once, was that she might be looking in the wrong direction entirely. Let me tell you about Grant's relationship with money. Not because it's the whole story, it's not, but because it's the thread. Pull it and everything else follows. He was not irresponsible in an obvious way. He didn't gamble. He didn't blow through cash on things you could point to. It was subtler than that. He was someone who moved through life at a standard he hadn't quite earned yet. Nice apartment, nice car, nice dinners. The kind of life that looks solid from the outside and is held together, just barely, by a series of arrangements he never fully disclosed. Nadia found this out in pieces. A comment here, a wage answer there. The way he deflected when she asked about his savings after the first year together. Not defensively, just smoothly. The way someone does when they've had a lot of practice redirecting a conversation. She didn't push. She respected his privacy. She was not the kind of partner who needed full financial disclosure before she was ready for it. That was very generous of her. What she didn't know, what she wouldn't find out until much later, was that the rough couple of years Grant had mentioned weren't rough in the way hard years usually are. They weren't the result of bad luck or a failing market or circumstances outside his control. They were the result of a pattern, a very specific, very practiced pattern of borrowing against future comfort, of finding soft places to land. And Nadia, with her savings account and her stability and her deep, genuine love for him, was the softest place he'd found in years. If you've ever been someone's plan without knowing it, you already understand exactly what I'm describing. If you haven't, stay with me. Because this is the part where the picture starts to come into focus. Iris came home from Nadia's guest room in early October. By November, Grant was sleeping on the far edge of the bed. By December, he had started going to the gym at 6 in the morning, which, on its own, means nothing. Except that Grant had never once expressed interest in the gym in the 3 years Nadia had known him. She noticed. She filed it. She didn't say anything yet, because she was still in fix-it mode, still convinced that if she gave him enough room, the distance would close on its own. It didn't close. In January, he started working late. Not every night, just enough nights that it became a pattern she couldn't ignore anymore. She asked him about it once, gently, over dinner. He said the quarter was brutal. He said he was sorry he'd been so distracted. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand, and looked at her with something that she would later spend a long time trying to name. Not love, not guilt exactly, Something that looked, in retrospect, like relief. Like a man who has just realized the exit is closer than he thought. She went to bed that night, telling herself she was being paranoid. She had always had an anxious mind. She knew this about herself. She was good at finding patterns that weren't there. She was good at making mountains. She was probably making a mountain. She was not making a mountain. But here's what I want you to understand about Nadia, because this is important. She was not naive. She was not someone who ignored her instincts because she was afraid of what they'd find. She ignored them because she had made a $43,000 investment in this relationship, and in this man, and in the life she thought they were building. And the alternative, the thing her gut was quietly insisting on, was not something she was ready to hold yet. That's not weakness. That's the very human math of having given too much to look clearly at what you gave it to. If that lands somewhere in you, if you recognize that specific kind of not looking, I think you belong here. Hit subscribe. There are a lot more stories like this one waiting for you. The Tuesday in February came on a morning that was ordinary in every way. She had made coffee, she had checked her phone, she had been running through her schedule for the day when she heard him come downstairs slower than usual. And something in the pace of his footsteps, something she couldn't have named if you'd asked her, made her set her mug down before he said a word. He sat across from her. He folded his hands on the table. And he said he needed space. He needed space. That was it. That was the whole sentence. No context attached, no explanation offered. He sat across from her with his hands folded like he was about to deliver a quarterly report and said he needed space and then waited. And Nadia, composed, practical, trained to stay calm Nadia, did the thing she always did. She asked questions, measured ones. What does that mean? How much space? Is there something specific that's happened? Is this about us, about work, about his mother, about something she'd done? He said it wasn't about anything she'd done. He said he just needed time to figure some things out. She asked if he was seeing someone else. He looked at her like the question had genuinely surprised him. Not offended, not defensive, surprised, like it hadn't occurred to him that she'd go there. Which is either the sign of a man who is completely innocent or the sign of a man who is very, very good at this. He said no. She believed him. Or she believed the version of him she had spent 3 years building in her mind, which is not the same thing, but feels identical from the inside. He moved out 2 weeks later, into an apartment, and here's the first detail I need you to hold, that was already furnished. Already furnished. Not a sublet, not a short-term rental with somebody else's couch, his own furniture, his own dishes, his own bed frame assembled in a 1-bedroom in a building 20 minutes from the apartment they had shared. The kind of apartment you arrange before you have the conversation. The kind of apartment that means the conversation was never really a conversation. It was a notification. Nadia found this out because she helped him move. Because of course she did. Because she was still in the mode of being the person she had always been in this relationship, and that person helped. That person showed up. That person carried boxes into an elevator and stood in the middle of a living room that already had a rug in it and said nothing. Because saying something would have required her to know clearly what she was looking at. She wasn't there yet. Here's what she didn't know on that moving day. Here's what the audience gets to see before she does. 6 weeks before the surgery, before Iris's diagnosis, before the $43,000, before any of it, Grant had been in a conversation with someone, a woman named Petra. They had met through a mutual friend the previous spring. They had stayed in loose contact the way people do when there's an interest that neither of them is ready to act on yet. When Iris got sick, Grant went quiet with Petra. He was dealing with something, he told her. He'd explain later. She waited. She was patient. She was, and this word is going to feel very deliberate when you hear it, available. The recovery period. The 6 weeks Iris spent in Nadia's guest room. The weeks when Grant was attentive and grateful and said all the right things. During those 6 weeks, Grant and Petra started talking again. Slowly at first, then not slowly. By the time Iris went home, they were talking every day. The gym at 6 in the morning was not the gym. The late nights at work were not work. And the furnished apartment, the apartment that was ready before the conversation happened, Petra had helped him find it, had gone with him to look at it, had stood in the empty living room while he measured the windows. Nadia was carrying boxes into a life that had already been arranged around someone else. That's the thing about this kind of betrayal. It's not a moment. It's not one bad decision made in a weak night. It's a project. It takes planning. It takes a sustained, deliberate effort to keep one hand extended toward someone while the other hand is already reaching for the door. That takes a specific kind of person, and it leaves a very specific kind of mark on the person who was kept in the dark long enough to be useful. I have to ask you something, and I want you to actually think about it before you answer in the comments. At what point does staying become something you did to yourself? Not because you were foolish, not because the signs weren't there, but because you had given enough that walking away felt like proving something terrible about yourself. Where is that line for you? Nadia didn't connect the furniture to anything that day. She told herself it came with the lease. She told herself she was being paranoid again. She drove home alone and sat in the parking lot of her building for 11 minutes. She knows it was 11 because she checked her phone twice, before she could make herself go upstairs. And when she got inside, she stood in the guest room, the one with the new linens and the white noise machine and the basket she had put together for Edith. She stood there for a long time. Something was trying to reach her. She wasn't ready to let it in yet. The thing about almost knowing is that it has a sound. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's more like a frequency you start picking up in the background of ordinary moments. A wrong note in a familiar song that you keep dismissing because the rest of the melody sounds fine. Nadia had been hearing it for months. She had been turning the volume down on it for months. In March, she turned the volume up. It started with Edith. They had kept in touch after the surgery, Nadia and Edith, which in retrospect is its own kind of thing to sit with. Edith texted. Edith checked in. Edith sent a photograph of the garden she'd started in her backyard. Said the doctor told her being outside was good for recovery. Said she owed that recovery to Nadia, and meant it, or seemed to. They made plans to have lunch. The first week of March, a Tuesday, a diner Edith liked near her house. And Nadia went because she loved Edith, genuinely, and because Grant being gone didn't mean she had to lose everyone. The lunch was warm, easy even, in the way that some conversations are when both people have decided in advance to stay on the surface. They talked about Edith's garden and Nadia's work and a book they'd both read. They did not talk about Grant until Edith brought him up near the end, carefully, the way you approach something you've rehearsed. She said she hoped Nadia was doing okay. She said she knew this had been hard. She said Grant was, and here she paused, in a way that Nadia would think about for a long time afterward. Complicated. Not a bad person. Complicated. Nadia asked what she meant. Edith looked at her coffee cup. She said Grant had always had a hard time with stillness, that he loved people most at the beginning, when everything was new and the feeling was uncomplicated, that she had watched him move through relationships since he was young, and she had always hoped, she was his mother, so she had always hoped, that the right person would change that. She looked up at Nadia then. She said, "I thought you were the right person." Past tense. Nadia drove home from that lunch and sat with what Edith had just handed her. Not an accusation, not a confession on his behalf. Just a mother, choosing the closest thing to honesty she could manage while still protecting her son. Just enough truth to be useful if Nadia was ready for it. She was starting to be ready. She went back through things. Not obsessively. She wants to be clear about that. Or she was clear about it when she eventually told this story. But methodically. The way a respiratory therapist goes back through a chart when something in a patient's presentation stops adding up. Looking for the thing she missed. She found the gym. Not the location. She already knew he hadn't been going. What she found was the membership. A gym he had signed up for in September, a week after Edith left their apartment. A gym that was not near their home, not near his office, not near anywhere that made geographical sense, unless what it was near was something else entirely. She found it because she still had access to a shared account they'd used for household subscriptions. He had forgotten to remove it. Or he hadn't thought she'd look. Or, and this is the version she lands on now, he had simply stopped being careful because he no longer needed to be. When a person stops maintaining the lie, it usually means they've already made the decision. The carelessness isn't an accident, it's an exhale. She did not confront him with the gym. Not yet. She held it. She kept looking. The furnished apartment was next. She thought about it differently now, with new eyes. Called the building's leasing office under the pretense of asking about availability, asked how long the wait list typically was for furnished units. The woman on the phone said they didn't offer furnished units, that all their apartments were unfurnished, that the only way to get a furnished one-bedroom in that building was to bring your own furniture, or to have someone help you bring it. Nadia sat on the floor of her kitchen when she hung up the phone. Not dramatically, she just sat down. The way you do when your legs make a decision before your brain catches up. She sat on the floor, and she looked at the cabinet across from her, and she thought about the Tuesday in February. The folded hands, the face she couldn't read. He had already been gone before he left. She had been the last to know. The last to know and the first to pay. And she still didn't have the whole picture. That was coming. She found Petra on a Wednesday. Not through anything dramatic, no hired investigator, no late-night spiral through social media. She found her the way you find most things when you finally decide to look. By following the one thread that didn't quite match the rest of the fabric. The gym membership was billed to an email address Grant used for personal subscriptions. An email she had the password to because he'd once asked her to check something in it and never changed it after. She had never looked before. She wanted to be clear about that. 3 years together and she had never once opened his inbox. She opened it now. She was not looking for Petra. She was looking for the gym confirmation, for the date, for the timestamp that would tell her how early the lie had started. Petra found her. The first email was from April of the previous year, a year before the surgery, a year before the Tuesday in February, a year before any of the things Nadia had been using as reference points, which meant the reference points were wrong. The timeline was wrong. She had been calculating from the wrong starting place entirely. The email was light, casual, the kind of message that is designed to look like nothing if someone happens to see it. Just two people staying in touch. But there were more, pages of them, and they told a story that was very different from the one Nadia had been living. Here is what the emails showed her. Grant and Petra had been building something, slowly, carefully, for the better part of a year before Iris got sick. Petra knew about Nadia. Not everything, not the full picture, but she knew Grant was with someone. She had asked once, in the fall, what he was going to do about it. He had told her he was working on it, that things were complicated, that she should trust him. And then Iris's diagnosis arrived. And something shifted in the emails. Something Nadia read 3 times because she needed to be sure she was understanding it correctly. Grant told Petra the timing was bad, that he couldn't make a move right now, not with his mother sick, that it would look wrong, that he needed to wait until things stabilized. Until things stabilized. Nadia sat with that phrase for a long time. He had not stayed through his mother's illness because he loved Nadia. He had not stayed because he was committed or conflicted or trying to do the right thing. He had stayed because leaving during a medical crisis would have made him look bad. Because Nadia had the money and the guest room and the steadiness and the capability that the situation required. Because she was, in that specific window, too useful to lose. He had waited until Iris recovered, until the debt was paid. Not by him, never by him. And the crisis had passed, and there was nothing left to extract. And then he had sat down at the kitchen table with his hands folded and told her he needed space. The furnished apartment was the period at the end of a sentence he'd been writing for over a year. She closed the laptop. She stood up. She walked to the window of her apartment and looked at the street below, and felt something she had trouble naming in the moment, and would later describe as a specific kind of clarity. Not peace, not anger, not yet. Just the lifting of a fog she hadn't known was there. The world outside the window looked the same as it always had, and she was a completely different person than she'd been an hour ago. She had not overreacted. She had not been too sensitive. She had not invented the distance or manufactured the unease, or been paranoid when her gut sent up a signal she kept suppressing. She had been right, every time, from the beginning. She just hadn't trusted it. That's the part that stays with her. Not the money, though $43,000 is not nothing, and we are going to come back to that. Not Petra, who is almost beside the point. Not even Grant, not really, because Grant had shown her who he was in small ways from the very beginning, and she had made accommodations every time. The part that stays with her is the moment in the waiting room. The plastic chair, the fluorescent lights. His voice saying, "You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever loved." She wonders now if he meant it, if some version of it was real, in that moment, in the way that people like Grant can mean something fully, while simultaneously meaning something else entirely underneath it. She wonders if that's better or worse. She hasn't decided. But she had one thing left to do, and she did it. She called him. Not to argue, not to fall apart on the phone and give him the satisfaction of knowing how much damage he'd done. She called him the way she approached everything, composed, direct, clear. She told him she had been in his email. She told him she knew about Petra. She told him she knew about the timeline, the gym, the apartment that was already furnished before he'd had the decency to tell her it was over. She told him she knew he had stayed through his mother's surgery because leaving would have been inconvenient for him. There was a long silence, and then he said he was sorry she'd found out that way. Not sorry he'd done it, sorry she'd found out. The distinction matters. She noticed it immediately, and she didn't say anything in response because there was nothing to say. That sentence told her everything she needed to know about who she was dealing with and what any further conversation would cost her. She told him she expected him to repay the $43,000. He said that wasn't something he was in a position to do right now. She said she understood. What she understood was that she was never going to see that money from him voluntarily. What she also understood was that she had documentation, 3 years of it. Texts, emails, records of the transfer, records of the hospital stay. She had, it turned out, the kind of paper trail that a lawyer could do something with, that a civil case could be built around, that could, under the right framing, constitute financial fraud between intimate partners. She did not tell him any of this on the phone. She just said she understood, and she said goodbye, and she hung up. She had a consultation with a lawyer the following week. I'm not going to tell you exactly how it resolved. Not because I don't know. Nadia was very specific when she told this story. But because the resolution is not actually the point. Whether the number she eventually recovered was half or all or more, the point is not the money. The point is what she did with the clarity. Because here's what changes when the fog lifts. When you stop explaining away the signals and stop making accommodations for someone who was never going to make them for you. What changes is not that you become harder. It's almost the opposite. You become more precise. You get better at knowing the difference between someone who is genuinely struggling and someone who has decided that your steadiness is a resource to be managed. Nadia got better at that, very quickly, with very little sentimentality about it. She still thinks about Iris sometimes, about the lunch at the diner and the word complicated, and the way Iris looked at her coffee cup before she looked up. She doesn't know how much Iris knew. She has decided she doesn't need to know. Some questions are less useful than the peace you find by letting them go. She still has the guest room. She got rid of the white noise machine, but kept the linens because they were expensive, and they were hers, and she wasn't going to let that be one more thing she lost. She is 36 now. She is, by her own account, doing well. Not in a performing way. In the way where doing well means she trusts the thing in her chest that notices when something is off, where she doesn't talk herself out of the noticing anymore. She said something to me when she told this story that I keep coming back to. She said, I didn't lose 3 years. I spent 3 years learning exactly what I'm worth and exactly what I'll never settle for again. That's not a loss. That's expensive education. She paused. Then she said, I just wish I'd gotten a receipt. I love her for that. Here's what I want to leave you with. Not a lesson. You don't need me to hand you a lesson. You are already doing that work. Just this. The moment you find yourself building a case for why something that feels wrong is probably fine, stop. The defense attorney in your head is not protecting you. She is protecting the story you want to be true. Trust the thing that noticed first. You already knew. You just needed permission to trust it. If someone in your life came to mind during this story, someone you've been building a case for, drop a burning fire emoji in the comments. You don't have to explain. I'll know what you mean. And if you want to stay in the room for the next one, I have a story about a woman who found out her sister had been lying to her family for 9 years. Not in a dramatic way, in the quiet, consistent, impossible to prove way that is somehow so much worse. That one's coming. I'm Dee. People always show you who they are. Fur by firelight just slows it down. I'll see you in the next one.